An entire town mocked me all autumn. But when the power grid failed in a 50-year blizzard, my broken windmill was the only thing keeping them alive.
Christmas Eve in Hollow Creek Valley, Montana. A line of 50 cold and starving people waited in the snow outside a rusted windmill the whole town had once called a joke. 3 months without power, 3 months without bread. The man at the barn door was the same veteran they had mocked all autumn, Jax Harlan, sleeping in his truck, broken by a war and a wife and a country that forgot him. Beside him stood Smoky, his German Shepherd from combat, watching every face with quiet, ancient eyes. What did one discarded soldier see in a dead piece of metal that an entire valley could not? Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The cold in Hollow Creek Valley arrived in the second week of October that year, weeks earlier than anyone in the small Montana town had expected, settling into the bones of the land with the patient, deliberate weight of something that intended to stay. It came down out of the mountains in a thin, hard wind that smelled of distant pine and old snow, and the faint metallic bite of weather that had not yet broken, sliding through the seams of every door and the gaps of every window and the cracked clapboard of every barn within 50 miles of the highway. On the eastern edge of the valley, where the paved county road bent away from town and trailed into a long gravel access route lined with broken split-rail fencing, the wind moved across 12 abandoned acres and wrapped itself around a motionless steel windmill that had not turned in nearly 40 years. It rattled the tin sheeting on the collapsed dairy barn beside it. It pushed through the empty window frames of the farmhouse that crouched low against the earth like an animal too tired to move. And inside that farmhouse, in the gutted shell of what had once been a living room, a man named Jax Harlan opened his eyes in the dark and lay still beneath 2 thin army surplus blankets, listening to the wind speak to a piece of land he had bought with the last money he had in the world. The pre-dawn air inside the farmhouse hung at 34 degrees according to the small battery thermometer he had nailed to the wall above the wood stove, and the cold was the kind that settled across exposed skin like a wet cloth, the kind that made a man's breath visible in the grey light, the kind that made a body's smallest movement feel like an act of will rather than an act of habit. The wood floor beneath his cot was warped and split in places, the boards groaning faintly beneath the canvas as he shifted his weight, and somewhere above him in the rafters a single beam creaked with the slow tongue clicking sound of old timber settling against the cold. He lay on his back for a long minute, letting his eyes adjust to the grey, letting his lungs find the rhythm of the room, letting the soldier in him do the slow, automatic work of mapping the space again, as he had mapped every space he had slept in for the past 3 years. A heavy, controlled breath answered him from the floor by the wood stove, then another, then the soft, muffled sound of a heavy tail thumping once against the warped boards. "Morning, soldier," Jax said quietly, his voice rough as gravel against the inside of his throat. Smoky lifted her head from where she lay on the folded canvas tarp that served as her bed, her thick double coat catching the faint pre-dawn light from the cracked window like a layer of pale frost, her amber eyes meeting his with the steady, patient attentiveness of an animal that had been awake for some unmeasurable time before he was. She did not get up, she did not whine. She simply held his gaze the way she had held it through 28 months of overseas deployment, through 3 months of military hospitals, through a year of motel rooms and parking lots and rest stop bathrooms, and now, through these long quiet weeks in a farmhouse the previous owner had walked away from without a backward glance. Her tail thumped once more, the smallest acknowledgement, the smallest assurance. "We are still here." He sat up slowly, swung his legs over the edge of the cot and pulled on his boots in the dark. His hands moved without any thought at all, lacing each boot with the tight cross pattern he had learned at 19, and never relearned since, his fingers stiff with cold but obedient. The boots were combat issue, scarred at the toes from places he did not name even to himself, and the leather had cracked at the seams in a way no civilian polish would ever repair. He stood, pulled on the worn military surplus jacket that had become a second skin to him, the cuffs of the sleeves frayed where his wrists had rubbed against them for too many years, and walked across the bare living room toward the wood stove with the deliberate, even pace of a man who had been taught, a long time ago, never to move faster than the situation required. He fed the stove, 3 split logs from the small stack against the wall, laid across the dim red bed of coals, the bark catching almost immediately in a soft crackle of awakening fire. He shut the cast-iron door, waited the half-second his hands had learned to wait, then turned the small green propane burner on the camping stove that sat on the low table beside the wood stove. The igniter clicked. Click. His shoulders did not move, his face did not change, but somewhere behind his ribs, in a small and specific place that no amount of training had ever managed to silence, a thin filament of memory tightened and pulled and tried to drag him out of the cold farmhouse and into a vehicle on a road in Helmand, the dust still in his teeth, the radio chatter still in his ears, the sound of the ignition switch still turning over in a Humvee that had not yet exploded. He did not let it pull him. He breathed in for 4 counts, held for 2, breathed out for 6, and watched the small blue flame steady itself beneath the dented kettle. He named 7 things he could see: the kettle, the stove, the window frame, the empty nail above the door, the folded blanket on the cot, Smoky's amber eyes, the shape of his own hand. He named them slowly, in order the way he had been taught. Smoky was already standing. She had risen at the click. She did not bark, did not press against him, did not interfere. She simply stood in the doorway of the room with her ears forward and her body angled slightly toward him, watching him with the calm, total attention of a partner who knew, every single morning, exactly what he was carrying through that small filament of memory and exactly when he had set it down again. When his shoulders eased, hers eased with him. When his breath returned to its even rhythm, her tail lifted slightly. When he turned to pour the coffee grounds into the small enamel pot, she walked across the floor and sat beside the wood stove, her flank pressed lightly against his leg. "Good morning to you too," he said, low. His scarred hand came down and rested on the warm crown of her head, and for a long moment the only sound in the farmhouse was the slow rolling boil of water in a dented kettle, and the slow steady breath of a German Shepherd who had served 3 tours alongside him before a piece of shrapnel through her hindquarters had ended a career neither of them had asked to end. The coffee was bitter and too hot. He drank it from a tin cup beside the stove while she ate her measured cup of kibble from a steel bowl on the floor, and neither of them spoke. Outside, the wind moved across the windmill and the eastern fields and pushed at the door, and the grey of the world began to turn slowly toward the pale, cold blue of a Montana dawn. The property had cost him $11,000 in cash, 12 acres of frost-cracked earth, a collapsed dairy barn, a farmhouse with a partial roof and no running water, and 1 rusted air motor windmill staked into the limestone shelf at the high northwest corner of the land. The realtor had been a thin woman in a rust-coloured coat who had walked him around the place in late August with a kind of apologetic embarrassment, as though she could not quite believe anyone was looking at the listing seriously, as though she expected him at any moment to ask her where the actual house was. He had not asked. He had walked the perimeter twice, looked at the windmill for a long time, looked at the way the wind moved off the bench above the property, and funneled down through the corridor where the old farm road curved around the high ground, looked at the angle of the foundation of the dairy barn relative to the prevailing weather, and then he had told her he would take it. She had been so surprised she had asked him twice. He had paid her in cash from a heavy canvas backpack he had carried into her office in the small Main Street storefront, counted out in $100 bills that had been worn soft from the months they had spent folded in the bottom of that same bag. She had handed him the keys. He had not used them. The locks were rotted out anyway. Smoky had walked the place ahead of him on the day they moved in, her nose down, her ears forward, and when she had finished, she had come back to the truck and sat beside the door, and he had taken that as her permission. They had unloaded. The bag held the rest of his life. 1 change of clothes that fit. 1 change of clothes that almost did not. A toothbrush in a plastic case. 3 folded photographs, a worn, water-warped paperback edition of a book on small engine repair, a multi-tool, a wallet with $62 in it, and the contents of a single brown envelope. The envelope was the thing he could not look at and could not throw away. It contained the divorce papers, the custody filing, the bank notice from the joint account that had been emptied 2 weeks before the papers had been served on him, In the recovery wing of the military hospital in San Diego, it contained a letter from his lawyer explaining that the house, which had been in his wife's name because he had been overseas at the time of the purchase, was not his to contest, and that his pension share had been negotiated down through procedural means he did not have the energy to fight. It contained a final, very short note from his wife, Leela, written on a sheet of yellow legal paper in her small, slanted handwriting, telling him that she was tired of being married to a man who came home in pieces, that she had met someone that she hoped he understood, that Cora was being told he had been very sick and needed a long time to get better. Cora was 10. Cora was the only one in the entire envelope whose name still made his hands shake. Cora's last drawing was folded into a small square at the bottom of his wallet, drawn in wax crayon on the back of a placemat from a diner. He could no longer remember the name of two stick figures with brown hair holding hands beside a square house. The words Dad and Me printed in careful uneven block letters across the top. He had not seen her in 3 years. He kept the drawing because not keeping it would have been a kind of dying. The envelope sat at the bottom of the canvas bag beside the wood stove. He had not opened it in 8 months. By the time he had finished his coffee, the sky outside the broken kitchen window had warmed into a pale, washed-out blue, and the wind had eased into the steady, even pull he had been waiting for. He pulled on a wool watch cap and a pair of leather work gloves with the fingertips worn through, picked up the small canvas tool bag he had laid out the night before in the orderly arrangement of a man who had once laid out his gear for inspection at 4 a.m. every morning for years, and walked out into the cold of the high northwest field with Smoky moving silently at his left heel. The air motor stood at the highest point of the property, its 8-bladed steel fan frozen in place at a slightly tilted angle, as though it had been struck mid-turn by something it could not fight. The galvanized vane was buckled, the pivot head was orange with rust, the pull rod that should have engaged the brake assembly hung slack and broken inside the lattice tower. The whole machine looked, from any reasonable distance, like a dead steel flower planted by a patient that had forgotten what flowers were for. He had stood beneath it for almost an hour, the day he had bought the place, and Smoky had sat beside him the entire time, and he had said quietly to no one in particular, "This thing still wants to turn." He had begun the work in early September. He had begun it the way he began everything, slowly, methodically, without telling a single person what he was doing. He had pulled the head down with a chain hoist anchored to the bed of his truck, disassembled the gearbox on a tarp in the dirt, scraped 4 decades of caked grease and seized rust out of the cast iron casing with a wire brush, soaked the bearings in solvent for 3 days, machined a replacement crankshaft on a borrowed lathe at the abandoned irrigation depot 2 miles east, where the old retired pump foreman had let him work for the cost of a shared cup of coffee. He had welded patches into the buckled vane. He had freed the pivot head and replaced the leather pump rod packing with a kit ordered through the mail under the name on his old military ID. By the 2nd week of October he had the head reassembled and bolted back atop the lattice tower, and on a cold morning very much like this one, he had released the brake and watched the steel fan begin, with a slow reluctant groan, to turn for the first time in nearly 40 years. He had cried then, not loudly, not for long, just a single wet tightening at the corners of his eyes, his jaw locked, his hand on Smoky's shoulder, the wind pushing against his face and pulling the steel blades through their first slow circle. Smoky had pressed her body hard against his leg. The wind had taken his breath. The blades had turned. He had not let himself cry like that since the morning he had been told that the unit was being rotated home without 2 of the men he had carried through the worst of it. The thing he was actually building was not the windmill. The windmill was only the engine. He had found the catalogues on his 4th day on the property, in a wooden crate jammed into the rafters of the gutted farmhouse attic, sealed inside an oilcloth wrapping that had kept them dry through 40 winters. They were grain mill catalogues from a company called Meadows Mills out of North Carolina, dated 1958, full of black and white photographs of stone burr mills designed to be powered by belt drive from any rotational source. There were specifications, diagrams, owner installation notes, a letter handwritten on the back of an order form from a man named Henry Polk to his wife, listing the parts he would need to convert their windmill to a working flour mill before winter. Henry had never gotten around to it. Henry had died in 1962 according to a small printed obituary tucked inside the folded letter, and his wife had lived alone on the property until the early 70s, and then she had walked away and the place had passed through 3 owners and 40 silent years before Jax Harlan had come up the gravel access road in a mud-spattered pickup truck with a German Shepherd in the passenger seat and looked at the rusted air motor and seen exactly the thing Henry Polk had once seen. In a dairy barn that no longer had a roof, Jax had built a dry, insulated room out of salvage lumber and stoveboard, 8 feet by 12, with a tight-fitted door and a small cast-iron stove of its own. Inside that room, he had set the millstones. They had cost him $960 from a small operation in Tennessee that still cut burrs the old way, and he had hauled them up through the snow on a sled rigged behind the truck. And he had seated them on a stout oak frame he had built from beams scavenged from the collapsed dairy barn. He had run a leather belt from the windmill's main pulley down through a sheave on the side of the milling room. He had tested the alignment for 3 days running, tightening, loosening, listening to the way the stones turned against each other when the wind hit a certain steady speed. On the morning, the stones first ground a small handful of hard red winter wheat into a fine pale flour that drifted down into the catchbox like the first quiet snowfall of the year. He had stood in the small wooden room with Smoky pressed against his leg and the smell of fresh ground grain in the air, and he had said aloud, to no one, to the room, to the rebuilt machine, to the dog, to the absent ghost of a man named Henry Polk, there it is. Smoky's tail had thumped against the wood floor exactly once. He had not told anyone in the town of Hollow Creek what he had done. He had not told them what he was doing while he was doing it either. The town was 4 miles down the county road. The town did not need to know. The town had its own opinions about him already, and those opinions had been shaped through the long autumn by short visits to the feed store and the small grocery and the hardware shop, where he paid in cash and spoke as little as possible. And Smoky waited for him outside the door with the quiet, immovable patience of a soldier on watch. At the feed store, behind a counter scarred by 40 years of pocket change and pocket knives, stood a wide, grey-bearded man named Carl Hendricks. Carl was in his early 60s. Carl wore the same brown canvas coat every day of every season. Carl's voice was the kind of voice that filled a room without being asked to. Carl had opinions about everything, and a particular set of opinions about the man who had bought the old Polk place and was apparently now living up there with a German Shepherd and no electricity. Jax did not know what Carl's specific quarrel with him was. He only knew that every time he walked into the feed store, Carl found a way to say something just loud enough to be heard by whoever else happened to be in the store, and quiet enough not to cross any line that would make a man stop and answer back. Crazy windmill man's back. Government check finally clear. Harlan? You sure that dog eats better than you do? Jax had paid for his sack of rolled oats and his quart of 2-stroke oil and walked out of the store without turning his head. Smoky, at the end of her leash on the wooden porch, had watched Carl through the front window with the level, unreadable patience of a wolf watching a man with a knife. She had not growled. She had not stiffened. She had simply held her gaze on him, and Jax had been unable, even later, even back at the truck, to remember how long it had taken Carl to look away. That had been the pattern of his autumn. The town spoke. The town mocked. He paid in cash. He left. He drove the 4 miles back up the county road to the gravel access route, and the broken split-rail fence, and the rusted windmill that was no longer rusted. And Smoky walked the perimeter at his side, and the work continued. By the last week of October the mill was running. By the first week of November he had ground his first 100 pounds of wheat into clean fine flour, sealed into food-grade buckets he had picked up at a restaurant supply auction. By the second week of November he had bought a second-hand bread oven for $50 from an old man who had run a bakery out of his garage in the next county, and he had set it up in the small kitchen of the farmhouse and was baking bread in batches of 4 loaves at a time on Sundays and Wednesdays. He ate 1 loaf a week. He froze the rest in a small chest freezer. He ran off a deep cycle marine battery and a single solar panel he had wired to the south wall of the milling room. The rest went into the buckets. The buckets went into the dry cellar beneath the dairy barn. He did not know why he was making more than he could eat. He did not know what he was preparing for. He only knew that the work itself was the only thing that quieted the filament of memory behind his ribs, and that the smell of fresh ground grain and the slow turning of the steel blades above the lattice tower had become, somewhere in the long quiet weeks of the autumn, the closest thing he had to a reason to keep getting up in the mornings, on the cold, pale blue dawn that the wind first eased into its steady winter pull. Jax stood in the small wooden milling room with Smoky pressed against his leg, listened to the patient grinding of the stones, and watched the first thin trickle of pale flour come down into the catch-box like a slow, peaceful weather. Outside, 4 miles south, the town of Hollow Creek slept beneath a thin glaze of frost. Somewhere in that town, in a single-wide trailer on a lot at the eastern edge of the school district, a young widow named Maren Cole was rising for her 4:30 shift at the truck stop diner on the highway. She did not yet know his name, he did not yet know hers, but the wind that turned the 8-bladed steel fan above the rebuilt windmill would, before the month was finished, push her old Pontiac off the side of the highway with 2 children in the back seat, and a German Shepherd named Smoky would walk to a farmhouse door and decide for the both of them that the autumn of invisibility was over. Maren Cole was 34 years old, and on the morning of the second to last Wednesday in November, she stood at the small chipped formica counter of her single-wide trailer at 4:11 in the morning and folded 2 paper bags down to the right size for the lunches that her son and her daughter would carry to school in 7 hours. The bags were on their 4th use. She smoothed each one open with the side of her palm, pressed the bottom flat with the heel of her hand, and held them up briefly to the overhead light to check for tears she could not afford to ignore. The kitchen was cold. The trailer's furnace was set at 55 degrees the way it had been set at 55 degrees every night since the second week of September, and the cold settled across her bare forearms beneath the rolled sleeves of her diner uniform like a thin sheet of water she could not shake off. She had grown used to it. The children had grown used to it. The children pretended they did not notice it because they had learned, the way children of certain mothers learn, that their mother was much easier to live with when she could believe she had hidden the things she could not solve. The trailer had 3 small rooms and a bathroom the size of a closet. The wall heater rattled when it ran. The single window above the kitchen sink had a hairline crack across the upper corner that she had taped over with a strip of clear packing tape 4 winters ago and never replaced, because the tape had held and because the cost of a new pane of glass had always, somehow, been on the wrong side of the next paycheck. On the kitchen counter beside the bagged lunches sat a small stack of utility bills she did not need to open to read, a paperback library novel she had checked out 3 weeks ago and not yet had a single uninterrupted hour to begin, and a framed photograph of a man in his early 30s with a wide, easy smile and one arm thrown across the shoulders of a small, dark-haired boy. The man was Marcus Cole. The man had been Maren's husband for 9 years and the children's father for 7. The man had died on a wet stretch of Highway 89 north of Livingston 26 months ago in an accident involving a logging truck and a patch of black ice that the Department of Transportation had failed to treat in time. And the man's photograph still sat on the kitchen counter every morning because Maren had decided, in the first long weeks after his funeral, that the children would not grow up in a house where their father's face had been taken down. She made the lunches, 2 slices of the bread she had baked from a discount mix on Sunday, 1 slice of cheese, a thin smear of mustard, a single small apple cut into slices and pressed into a sandwich bag because cut apples felt to children like a kind of small luxury that whole apples did not. 2 paper bags, 2 folded napkins, 2 notes on the inside of each bag in pencil. "Have a good day, baby. I love you, Mum." In the back of the trailer, in the single bedroom the children shared. Her son Caleb was 9 years old and her daughter Lily was 7, and they slept curled together beneath the same heavy comforter the way they had slept together every night for the 2 years since their father had died. Maren walked back to the bedroom doorway and stood there for a long moment in the dim hallway light, watching them breathe in the dark. Caleb had Marcus's straight dark hair and Marcus's high forehead. Lily had Maren's freckles and her own mother's small obstinate chin. The comforter rose and fell. The wall heater ticked in the corner. Outside, the wind was already up. She closed the door softly, picked up her thermos, pulled on the heavy fleece jacket she had bought at the thrift store on Main Street for $9 3 winters ago, locked the trailer behind her, walked across the frozen yard to the old maroon Pontiac Bonneville that had been her father's last gift to her before he passed the year she got married, and that had run, with steadily increasing complaint, for the 11 years since she turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, and caught on the third try with a heavy, reluctant rattle from somewhere deep beneath the hood. The dashboard heater would not work today. She knew that the way she knew her own hands. She drove the 4 miles down to the highway with her gloved fingers wrapped around the cold steering wheel and her breath fogging in the air in front of her face. And at 4:30 she pulled into the gravel lot of the truck stop diner where she had worked the breakfast shift 6 days a week for the past 17 months. The diner's name was the Pine Crest. Its red letters glowed cold above the gravel lot. She walked in past the line of long-haul rigs idling in the dark with their parking lights on, past the smell of diesel and grease and warm coffee, and tied her apron around her waist before she had even said good morning to Faye on the register. By 5:15 she was carrying plates. By 6:30 the breakfast rush had started. Her hands moved in the particular rhythm she had built over 17 months of double shifts. 3 plates up the left arm, coffee pot in the right hand. Smile, refill, smile, refill, smile, refill. Her hands smelled of fryer oil and dish soap by 7 o'clock every morning, and they would smell that way until she scrubbed them with lemon juice that night before bed. She did not see her children again until 2:50 in the afternoon, when the school bus dropped them at the end of the gravel road and they walked the quarter-mile to the trailer in their thin coats. And on the second-to-last Wednesday in November, that bus did not get there. The first squall came down out of the mountains at 11:47 in the morning. The radio in the diner kitchen had been talking about it since Sunday. The meteorologists were calling it a precursor band. They were calling the bigger system behind it historic. They were saying once in 50 years, and they were saying it in the kind of careful, flat voices that meteorologists used when they were genuinely worried and trying not to start a panic. By noon the wind had shifted. By 12:30 the first heavy flakes were falling. By 1:15 the truck stop manager came out of the back office and told Maren that the school district had announced an early dismissal at 1:30 and that she should clock out and go get her kids. He did not need to tell her twice. He was a decent man. He understood what early dismissal meant for a woman with a $300 trailer payment and an 11-year-old Pontiac. She drove back up the 4 miles of county road in a snow that had gone, in the space of an hour, from light flurries to a thick steady fall that made the road's centerline disappear into white 10 feet beyond her headlights. The Pontiac handled the snow the way the Pontiac handled everything. With reluctant, honest effort, she picked up Caleb and Lily at the trailer at 2:15. They had walked themselves home from the school bus the moment the dismissal had been announced, the way she had told them to do in any emergency, and she found them already inside with their coats still on and their packed lunches still in their hands. Lily had cried. Caleb had not. Caleb was 9. Caleb had been the man of the house since he was 7, and he had been very serious about it. "Are we going to Grandma's, Mum?" he asked when she came through the door. "Just a drive into town, baby," she said. "Mrs. Hannity at church said she might have some things for us. Some things for the cold." Lily, smaller, looked up at her with the wide trust of a 7-year-old whose mother had not yet failed her in any way that she could remember. "An adventure?" "Yes, baby," Maren said. And she crouched down and zipped Lily's coat all the way up to her chin and tugged her wool hat down over her ears. An adventure? She had 2 reasons for needing to drive into town that afternoon, and only one of them was the old dented box of donated coats and blankets that the Hollow Creek Fellowship Church kept in the back hallway of its parish hall. The other reason was that the trailer's propane tank had run dry sometime in the last 48 hours. The wall heater had stopped putting out anything except the smell of cold metal, and she could not afford a full refill until Friday's paycheck cleared. The church had, twice in the last year, helped her cover the gap. She had not wanted to go. She had been telling herself, all the way through the long Sunday and the long Monday and the long Tuesday, that she would find another way. There was no other way. The temperature outside the trailer was 22 degrees and falling, and her 7-year-old daughter had a faint cough she had been pretending not to notice for 2 days. They got into the Pontiac. The car coughed twice and started on the third try, the way it always did. She backed out of the gravel drive. She turned south onto the county road. The snow was already heavy enough that she could not see 50 feet down the road. She kept her speed under 20. The wipers worked. The defroster did not. At 3:06 in the afternoon, on the long eastward bend of County Road 12, where the road climbed up onto the bench above the valley, and the wind came across the open ground in a hard funneling pull, the Pontiac's front-end suspension gave a long, shuddering groan, the steering wheel pulled hard to the right, and the car ground to a stop on the gravel shoulder with the unmistakable, terminal slowness of a vehicle that was not going any further today. Marin sat very still for a moment. Her hands were on the wheel. Her breath was visible in the cold, dim light of the cabin. The wipers continued to thump back and forth across a windshield that was already filling in faster than they could clear it. From the back seat, Caleb said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be 9 years old and not 7. "Mum, it's all right." "Baby," she said. "I'm going to look. Stay buckled." She got out into the snow. The wind hit her broadside. She squinted through the falling flakes and walked around to the front of the car and crouched down. And she did not need to be a mechanic to see the thin black river of fluid that had run out from beneath the engine and stained the gravel for 10 feet in either direction. The line had gone. She did not know what line. She knew that the car was not going to start again today, and that the temperature was 22 degrees and falling, and that the heater had not worked in the first place. And that there was no cell signal on this stretch of County Road 12 because there had never been cell signal on this stretch of County Road 12 in the 11 years she had owned the car. She looked east, down the road toward town, 4 miles. In this snow, with 2 children in coats not built for it, she looked west, up the road, 2 miles up the bench. At the broken split-rail fence she had passed every day for 17 months on her way down to the diner was the gravel access route that climbed into the old poke place. She knew there was a man living up there. She knew the rumours that the town had built around him. She knew the things Carl Hendricks had said about him at the feed store the one time she had been in there to buy salt blocks for her neighbour's horses. She also knew that 2 miles in this snow, with a coughing 7-year-old and a brave 9-year-old, was a great deal closer than 4. She got the children out of the car. She zipped Lily's coat. She put her own scarf around Caleb's neck. She held Lily on her hip and took Caleb's mittened hand. They started walking west up the county road into the wind. They had made it about 3/4 of a mile, and Lily had begun to cry into her shoulder, and Caleb was pulling his hand against hers, with the small, grim determination of a child, trying not to let his mother feel his weight, when Marin saw something move on the gravel access route ahead of them through the wall of falling snow. She stopped. She put a hand on Caleb's chest and held him still behind her. A German Shepherd came out of the snow. The dog was large. The dog's coat was dense and the colour of old smoke, frosted now along the edges with snow. The dog's amber eyes met hers across 40 feet of white road with the absolute unhurried assessment of an animal that knew exactly what it was looking at. Marin felt her own breath stop. The stories Carl Hendricks had told at the feed store flickered in the back of her mind. The dog did not move toward them. The dog stood still in the middle of the access route, with one front paw slightly lifted and her ears forward and her body angled, and then she turned her head and barked once. A short, controlled bark. Not a warning, an announcement. A man stepped out of the snow behind the dog. He was tall and lean, in a worn military surplus jacket that the wind moved through as though the jacket had been part of him for years. A wool watch cap, a dark beard, scarred hands held loose at his sides. He stopped about 30 feet from her. He did not raise his voice. He did not come closer. He looked at her, and he looked at the children behind her, and he looked at the snow that was already settling onto Lily's hat, and his face did not change at all. "Your car back there," he said. His voice was low and very quiet. "It died," Marin said. Her teeth were chattering. She did not know when they had started. "I'm sorry. I was trying to get to town." "Town's 4 miles," he said. "You won't make it." "I know." My place is 1/2 mile up that road. Wood stove. Coffee. Won't bother you. She stared at him. Her arms tightened around Lily. Caleb pressed himself silently against the back of her thigh. Smoky'll go ahead, the man said, and the dog turned her head when he said the name, the way a soldier turns at her own. She'll walk with the boy. He likes dogs. Yes, Caleb said quickly, before Marin could answer. The first word he had spoken in 20 minutes. The man did not smile. Something in his face eased, the way a stone might ease under a long warm rain. Then she'll walk with him. Marin stood for one more long second in the snow with her daughter on her hip and her son pressed against her leg, and she made the decision the way she made every decision in her life since Marcus had died. She made it on the children's behalf, and she made it without telling herself it was a decision at all. She nodded once. "Thank you," she said. The man turned. He started walking back up the access route into the snow. The German Shepherd came forward through the white, and Marin felt Caleb step out from behind her and stand very still as the dog approached him and stopped exactly one polite step away and lowered her head and waited. Caleb put his small mittened hand carefully on the dog's broad forehead. The dog's tail thumped once. Then she turned and walked beside him at his pace, neither faster nor slower, her body angled slightly between him and the wind. The boy began to walk. Marin followed with Lily on her hip. The man's broad back went on ahead of them through the snow. He never once looked behind him to see if they were keeping up. He did not have to. The dog was managing it. The farmhouse appeared out of the white 40 minutes later, a long, low grey shape crouched against the earth at the high end of a graded drive, with a tall steel windmill turning slow and even on the bench above it. Marin stopped at the gate and looked up at the windmill. The 8-bladed steel fan moved in the wind with a clean, unhurried rhythm, and a single belt ran down off the main pulley to a small wooden room at the side of a half-collapsed barn. From the small wooden room came the faintest, cleanest smell of fresh ground grain. The man held the front door of the farmhouse open. He did not say anything. He gestured with one hand. The German Shepherd herded the boy gently up onto the porch, with her flank pressed against his hip. Marin carried Lily through the door and into a room where a wood stove was already burning and the air was warm. She set Lily down carefully on a wooden chair beside the stove. She knelt and pulled the wet wool hat from the child's head and rubbed her hands on the small cold cheeks. The man crossed the room and added 2 split logs to the fire. The German Shepherd lay down on a folded canvas tarp by the wood stove, with her body curled into a half circle around the boy's feet. Caleb sat down very slowly on the floor next to her and laid one mittened hand on her shoulder, and the dog let out a long, slow breath, and the boy pressed his cold nose into her thick, warm fur and began, without making any sound, to cry. The man put a kettle on the propane burner. The igniter clicked. He paused. He breathed once, slowly. The kettle began to boil. He took a tin cup from a shelf and poured hot water into it and stirred in a measured spoon of instant coffee from a small jar and set the cup on the small table beside Marin without looking at her. "Coffee's bad," he said. "It's hot." "Thank you," Marin said. Her voice cracked. She did not know why. She wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the heat go through her gloves and into her palms, and she closed her eyes. He moved past her without looking at her, knelt down beside the wood stove and offered Lily, very gently, the corner of a clean folded blanket from a stack on top of the wood box. Lily took the blanket and pulled it around her shoulders the way a small frightened animal pulls a coat around itself, and then she looked up at the man with the wide, solemn eyes of a 7-year-old who had been told, all her short life, exactly what kind of strangers were dangerous, and her small lower lip trembled, and she said in a thin voice, "What's the dog's name?" The man looked at her for a long second. Something passed across his face. It was gone before Marin could name it. "Smoky," he said. "Her name is Smoky." "She's nice," Lily whispered. "Yes," he said. "She is—" He stood up. He did not introduce himself. Marin did not introduce herself either. They stayed in the farmhouse for the next 4 hours while the storm broke and reformed and broke again. And during those 4 hours, The man went out twice to the windmill and the milling room and came back each time with snow on the shoulders of his jacket and the smell of fresh ground grain on his hands, and the children fell asleep against the wood stove with the German Shepherd curled around their feet, and Maren sat in a wooden chair with a tin cup of bad hot coffee in her hands, and watched the man move through his own house with the controlled, quiet efficiency of a soldier who had been alone for a very long time. She saw the small wooden milling room through the window. She saw the millstones turning. She saw a stack of food-grade buckets along one wall through the open door. She did not ask. She was a woman who knew not to ask. When the storm broke at 7:30, he drove them back down the 4 miles of county road to the trailer in his old pickup truck. Smoky rode in the small cab pressed against Caleb's leg. The Pontiac was a snow-covered hump on the eastward bend. He pulled into the gravel drive of the trailer, got out without a word, walked around the truck, and lifted Lily down out of the passenger seat. He set her gently on her feet. Maren stood beside her in the cold. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know your name." "Jax," he said. "Jax Harlan." Maren Cole. These are Caleb and Lily." He nodded once. He looked at the children. He looked, very briefly, at the dark trailer behind her, with its dead wall heater and its empty propane tank. He did not say anything about it. He reached into the bed of the truck and lifted out a 10-gallon propane bottle and set it down beside her without explanation. "Spare," he said. "Bring it back when you can." He did not wait for her to protest. He got back into the truck, called Smoky once, and drove away down the gravel road with his tail lights disappearing into the falling snow. Maren stood for a long time in the dark beside the trailer with her hand on the cold metal of the propane tank, and her 2 small children pressed against her sides. And she did not cry, because she had not cried in 26 months, and she was not going to start tonight. 4 days later, the big system the meteorologists had been warning about all week broke across the Continental Divide and came down into Hollow Creek Valley as a true ice storm, the kind of storm that comes once in 50 years, the kind of storm that takes the lights out of an entire valley and does not give them back for 90 days. And in the small wooden milling room above the broken split-rail fence, a man named Jax Harlan stood beside a turning windmill with a German Shepherd at his side. And he watched the eastern sky go black at 3 in the afternoon, and he understood with the cold clarity of a soldier who has been in many storms before, that the work he had been doing all autumn alone in silence was about to be the only thing standing between the valley below him and a winter it would not survive on its own. The ice came down on the valley in 2 waves. The first wave broke just before dark on Sunday afternoon and ran through the night, and by the time the dim grey of Monday morning bled up over the eastern bench, every tree from the south fork of the creek to the pass road carried 2 inches of clear armoured glaze on every branch. Every fence wire hummed under a coat of frozen rain that had welded the strands together into something that looked from a distance like the silvered hair of an old animal, and every overhead power line that ran the length of County Road 12 had begun the slow, terrible drooping that any lineman in the western mountains would have recognised as the 10 minutes before catastrophe. The second wave hit at 4:20 Monday afternoon, when the temperature dropped another 6 degrees, and the wind shifted, and the laden branches of the cottonwoods along the creek bed began to come down with a sound that, from the inside of any kitchen in Hollow Creek, sounded exactly like distant rifle fire. Jax Harlan was in the small wooden milling room at 4:23 when the first power line on the far side of the bench let go with the long, slow, whomping crack of high-tension wire snapping under load, and his body responded the way his body always responded to that exact sound, and his hands went still on the leather drive belt, and his head came up, and Smoky was already standing in the open doorway with her ears forward and her body angled toward him, watching him exactly the way she had watched him on every morning of the last 3 years. He breathed in for 4 counts, he held for 2, he breathed out for 6. He named 7 things he could see: the leather belt, the flour catch box, the grain hopper, the kerosene lamp on the shelf, the cast iron stove, the frosted window, Smoky's amber eyes. The lights in the farmhouse had not been on. The lights in the farmhouse had not been on since he had moved in. He did not know yet that the lights had gone out across the entire valley. He would not know until Wednesday. Down in town, The lights had gone out at 4:26 on Monday afternoon all at once as the second wave of the ice storm took out 3 substations and 7 primary feeders and 1 transmission tower in a span of about 40 minutes. The diner where Maren Cole worked the breakfast shift had closed at noon when the manager had read the weather forecast and told all 6 of his employees to go home. The school had let out at 11. The grocery on Main Street had stayed open through the afternoon and then locked its doors at 4:15 when the manager had received a phone call from his sister-in-law in Bozeman warning him that something very bad was coming. The town had gone to bed early on Monday under a thin yellow glow of battery flashlights and propane lanterns, and the town had woken on Tuesday morning to find that the world had been wrapped in a sheet of glass and that no one was coming to take the sheet of glass off it any time soon. By Wednesday afternoon, the situation was worse than anyone in Hollow Creek had thought possible. The county road into town was blocked in 3 places by fallen cottonwoods so large that the small county maintenance crew with the 1 chainsaw and the half tank of fuel that they had been able to scrape together could not move them in less than a week. The state line crews from the power company were stretched across 9 counties, and the dispatcher in Helena, when reached on the volunteer fire department's old single sideband radio, had told Sheriff Ed Briggs that Hollow Creek was on the priority list but was, in honest terms, looking at 30 days minimum. The grocery on Main Street had emptied of perishables by Thursday morning. The pharmacy was rationing from its small backup generator. 3 families on the west side of town had no propane at all, and the propane company's delivery truck was parked on a closed road outside Big Timber and was not getting through this week. On Friday afternoon, the volunteer fire department called an emergency town meeting at the Hollow Creek Fellowship Church, and Pastor John Daniels, who had served the small congregation for 31 years, stood up in the front of the unheated sanctuary in his heavy wool overcoat and asked his town to please be patient and please be careful and please look out for each other. Sheriff Briggs spoke after him. So did Mayor Tom Wexler, who was 68 years old and tired before any of this had begun, and looked. In the dim light of the kerosene lanterns lined along the front of the sanctuary, like a man who had aged 5 years in 5 days, the town had questions. The town had a great many questions. The town had, in the back third of the sanctuary, Carl Hendricks, who had stood up at minute 15 of the meeting and begun to ask his questions in the kind of voice that filled a room without permission. Tom: "When's the road getting cleared?" "We don't know." Carl: "Could be a week. Could be more." "And the power?" Helena said 30 days minimum. 30 days? Yes. Tom: "You got people out here without propane. You got the Schmidts. You got the Linwoods. You got that woman lives out by the old Polk place with those 2 kids. We're sitting here on what? 440 pounds of flour at the grocery. Half a side of beef." Carl: "We're going to get organised. Pastor Daniels and I are going to set up a—" Tom: "The room had gone quiet then, in the way a room goes quiet when a man's voice carries the weight of something he has been holding for too long." Carl had stepped forward into the aisle with his thumbs hooked in the pockets of his brown canvas coat, his grey beard catching the lantern light, his big square hands trembling very slightly at the cuffs in a way that he himself did not seem to notice. "My grandkids are with me and Sue," he said, more quietly. "My boy's wife and the kids. Came up from Billings ahead of the storm. We're going to run out of food by next Friday. So's everybody else in this room. So I want to know what you and the pastor and the sheriff are going to do about it." The mayor had looked down at his hands. Pastor Daniels had said something about sharing what they had. Sheriff Briggs had said they would look at every option and that nobody in Hollow Creek was going to go hungry on his watch, and his voice had cracked just enough on the words to let the room hear that he was not certain. Maren Cole had been sitting in the second-to-last pew of the sanctuary with Caleb on one side of her and Lily on the other side of her, both children wrapped in their thrift store coats with the hoods up, both children leaning into her hips for warmth. She had been listening, she had been thinking, she had been remembering a small wooden milling room and a stack of food-grade buckets and a smell that had been the cleanest smell she had encountered in 2 years. She stood up. She did not stand up the way she had ever stood up at a town meeting before. She had only ever been to 2 town meetings in her 17 months in Hollow Creek, and she had not spoken at either of them. She stood up now in the cold, dim sanctuary of the Hollow Creek Fellowship Church, and the entire room turned to look at her, because in a town of 437 people, every face in a room like that one was the face of someone who knew you. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was thinner than she would have liked. She steadied it. "There's a man up on the old Polk place," she said. "His name is Jax Harlan. He moved in late August." A small, low sound went around the room. Maren did not look at Carl Hendricks. She did not look at anyone. She looked at the worn wooden pew in front of her, and she said the words she had practiced in her head in the dark on Tuesday and Wednesday nights. "He took us in last Wednesday afternoon when my car broke down on the bench in the squall. Me and the kids. He kept us by his wood stove for 4 hours and drove us back to town when it was safe. He gave me a 10-gallon propane bottle off the bed of his truck. He's still got that bottle out there for any of us. I think—" She paused. She pressed her hands flat against the wood of the pew in front of her. "He has a working windmill up there. He's rebuilt it. He's got a stone burr mill running off it. I saw it. He's got food-grade buckets stacked in the milling room. I saw those too. I don't know how much, but I know he's been grinding flour for 2 months." The silence in the sanctuary that followed was the silence of 240 people doing a great deal of thinking at once. Carl Hendricks broke it. Of course Carl Hendricks broke it. "Maren, honey," he said. And the way he said honey was not the way her grandmother said honey. "You sure about that? Crazy windmill man, probably grinding rats and calling it dinner." She turned. She looked at him. She did not raise her voice. "Mr. Hendricks," she said. "He fed my kids without saying a word. He gave me a propane bottle worth $140 and didn't ask my last name. I'm not asking you to like him. I'm telling this room what I saw." The sanctuary stayed quiet. Pastor Daniels stepped down from the front. He walked halfway down the aisle. He looked at Maren with the careful, weighing expression of a man who had been a pastor for 31 years and had learned, in those 31 years, exactly what kind of woman did and did not make things up. "Maren," he said, "you saw the mill running." "I saw it. And the buckets. Stacked floor to ceiling along the south wall. I didn't count. Could be hundreds of pounds." Pastor Daniels looked at the mayor. The mayor looked at the sheriff. Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. Then the sheriff stood up, slowly, the way a man stands up when he has not been on the right side of his own bed for 3 nights in a row, and he said, "Ed and I will go up there in the morning." The morning came in at 12 degrees below zero. Sheriff Ed Briggs drove up the gravel access route in his old 4-wheel drive with chains on all 4 tyres at 20 minutes past 9 on Saturday morning. Mayor Tom Wexler was in the passenger seat. Pastor John Daniels was in the back. None of them had slept well. The truck climbed slowly through the rutted ice. They came around the last bend, and the farmhouse appeared, and above the farmhouse, on the bench, the 8-bladed steel fan of the rebuilt air motor was turning at a clean, even speed in a wind that made the cottonwoods on either side of the drive sing like a harmonica played from a great distance. Smoky met them at the gate. She was sitting in the middle of the gravel drive about 30 feet inside the cattle guard, square on her haunches, ears forward, body still, amber eyes locked on the windshield of the truck. Sheriff Briggs braked. The 3 men sat in the cab and looked at her. The dog did not move. The dog was not threatening them. The dog was very plainly asking them what their business was. "That dog ain't moving," Tom, the sheriff, said. "I see that. That's a working dog. That ain't a pet." "I see that too." The farmhouse door opened. Jax came out into the cold in his old military surplus jacket. He walked down the steps with his scarred hands shoved into his pockets and his beard frosted at the edges, and he stopped about 10 feet from Smoky and said one quiet word that none of the 3 men in the truck heard, and the dog rose and walked back to him and sat down at his left heel. The sheriff opened his door. "Mr. Harlan," he called. "Yeah, Ed Briggs, Hollow Creek Sheriff. This is Mayor Wexler." "This is Pastor Daniels." "All right. Could we talk to you?" Jax stood for a long second in the cold, with one hand on Smoky's shoulder. He did not look afraid. He did not look angry. He looked the way a man looks who has known a conversation was coming for a week and had decided not to spend any of his energy bracing for it. "Come on in," he said. "Coffee's bad." "It's hot." The four of them sat at the small wooden table in the kitchen of the farmhouse. Smoky lay on the floor between Jax's chair and the wood stove. The kerosene lamp was lit, the wood stove was running. The room was warmer than any of the three men in the chairs across from him had been in 5 days. Jax poured 4 tin cups of coffee from the dented enamel pot. He sat down. He waited. Mayor Wexler cleared his throat. "Mr. Harlan," he said. "Maren Cole came to the meeting last night." "All right. She told us about your mill." "All right. We need food. Groceries gone perishable. Town's looking at 30 more days minimum without power, and probably a week before the road's clear." "All right." The mayor stopped. He looked at the sheriff. The sheriff looked at the pastor. The pastor said, very quietly, "Mr. Harlan, do you have flour?" Jax took a long, slow sip of his coffee. He set the cup down. He looked at each of the 3 men in turn. "I have wheat," he said. "I have a mill. I don't have time for jokes anymore. Bring people who can work. Bring whatever wheat you have or can find. I'll keep the mill turning as long as the wind keeps blowing." The mayor's eyes filled. The mayor did not realize they had filled until Pastor Daniels reached out and put one hand on his forearm. The sheriff stared at the table for a long moment with his jaw locked. "Mr. Harlan," the mayor said, very quietly, "we owe you an apology. Son." "You don't owe me anything," Jax said. "Bring me workers." By Sunday afternoon, the small wooden milling room above the broken split-rail fence had become the operational center of Hollow Creek Valley, Montana. Pastor Daniels organized the labor. Sheriff Briggs organized the wheat collection from every household in the valley that had a 50-pound sack in its pantry from one of last year's bulk buys. Mayor Wexler organized the rationing. The Hollow Creek Fellowship Church became the distribution point. The men with chainsaws and the fuel to run them began to clear the county road. 3 of Maren Cole's neighbors, 2 men in their 50s and a younger man who had played football in high school 9 years ago, drove up the gravel access route on Sunday morning with their own tools and their own gloves and the silent, grim faces of men who were past the point of pretending. Jax did not introduce himself, he pointed. He said, "You the catch box, you the bucket line, you the loading sled." They worked. By noon they had ground 60 pounds of flour. By dark they had ground 160. Smoky watched every man in that small wooden room with the patient, unreadable assessment of a soldier on guard duty, and not one of those men ever once felt watched in a way he could name, and not one of those men ever once stopped working long enough to look up and meet her amber eyes for more than a second. Maren came on Sunday afternoon with the children. She brought a bag of risen dough that she had mixed at the trailer that morning, with the propane he had given her, and a packet of yeast that had still been good. She baked 4 loaves of bread in the old $50 oven in the farmhouse kitchen. The smell of it filled the rooms in a way that made one of the older men with the chainsaws set his tool down in the middle of a cut and stand for a long moment in the doorway of the milling room with his eyes closed. She handed Jax the first loaf. He looked at it for a long moment. He did not say thank you. He nodded once very slowly and broke the loaf in half and offered one half back to her without a word. Caleb sat on the floor of the milling room beside Smoky's tarp. The boy fed the German Shepherd small pieces of crust from his pocket all afternoon, and the dog received each one with the careful, dignified attention of an animal accepting tribute from a soldier she had decided to like. By Tuesday morning of the second week, the cost was concrete. Jax had not been alone in his own house in 5 days. His mornings, which had been the slow, quiet, controlled mornings in which his body and his mind had learned to carry the weight of the day, had become mornings full of voices and footsteps and the smell of strangers' coats. The propane burner he used to make his own coffee was now used to make coffee for 6. The kerosene lamps were running 14 hours a day. The barn was loud. The milling room was loud. The system, gentle and imperfect and necessary as it was, had installed itself inside the walls of the only place in his life where his nervous system had ever been able to lay itself down and rest. He breathed in for 4 counts. He held for 2. He breathed out for 6. He named 7 things he could see. Smoky, every time, was one of them. She did not leave his side now, not for a minute. She walked the perimeter of every gathering. She watched every visitor. When one of the new men leaned down too quickly toward the millstones with a wrench raised in an angle that resembled too closely something else, Smoky stood up from her tarp without any sound at all and walked across the wood floor and sat down at Jax's left heel, and her shoulder pressed against his thigh, and her amber eyes locked onto the man with the wrench until the man looked up and lowered the wrench and stepped back. Jax never said a word. Smoky never had to. On the 7th evening of the operation, Maren came up the access road in her own car, which had been towed to the mechanic on Main Street and then pushed back to the trailer when there was no way to fix the line without parts that were not coming. The mechanic had loaned her a third-hand Chevy. She brought a pot of stew, the first hot meal Jax had eaten that he had not made himself in 5 days. She set it on the table. She did not stay. She left with Lily on her hip and Caleb walking out beside Smoky to the door, and she paused there with her free hand on the doorframe. "Jax," she said. "Yeah, thank you." He looked at her across the warm room with the soft yellow lamplight on her hair, and her 7-year-old asleep against her shoulder, and her 9-year-old looking up at him with a small grave expression. And he nodded once. "Drive safe," he said. She drove down the gravel road into the dark. He stood in the open door for a long time after she was gone. The wind moved across the bench. The windmill turned. Smoky leaned her flank against his calf. He put his scarred hand on her head. "I don't know what we're doing, soldier," he said quietly. Her tail thumped once against the wood. She did know. By the 5th week of the blackout, the snow against the north walls of the farmhouse stood almost to the eaves, and the cold inside the barn at 4 in the morning ran 12 degrees below zero on the small battery thermometer Jax had nailed to the doorframe of the milling room. The valley had passed the moment when patience could carry the weight of the days. The valley had moved into a kind of low electric exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that does not show on a face the first time you see it, but that begins to show in the way a man's hands shake very slightly when he sets down a coffee cup, in the way a woman's voice cracks halfway through a sentence she has said 100 times before, in the way a child stops asking when the lights are coming back on because the child has decided, on the basis of evidence she cannot articulate, that her mother does not know the answer, and that the answer is not one she would have wanted. The town was rationed. The town was tired. The town was beginning to talk. Jax had heard pieces of the talk from the men who came up the gravel access route to work the mill. He had heard pieces of it from Maren, who had not said it directly but had let it slip through her own silences, in the way a careful woman lets information through. He had heard it most clearly from Pastor Daniels, who had come up alone on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of the 5th week, with snow on his shoulders and a kind of thin, worried grief in his eyes, and had asked Jax without preamble whether he had a gun in the house. 2, Jax had said. Where? 1 in the truck, 1 under the bed. Loaded. The 1 under the bed. Good. Pastor Daniels had stood for a long moment in the kitchen of the farmhouse, with his hat in his hands and the wood stove cracking quietly behind him. "There's talk, Jax," he had said. "Finally." "I figured. Some of it, Carl. I figured. Some of it people who don't know any better and are scared and hungry and tired. All right. Some of it ugly. All right." The pastor had looked at the floor. He had looked back up. "They say you're hoarding. They say you're charging. They say you're military trained and not to be trusted. They say it loud enough for people to start believing it without thinking about whether it's true." Jax had nodded once. He had not been surprised. "I'm not charging," he had said. "I know that on... son, The mayor knows it. Half the men who come up here every morning know it. I'm telling you because I've been in this town a long time, and I know what this kind of talk does in a winter like this one. I want you to be careful. All right, especially at night. All right. Pastor Daniels had stood another moment, and then he had pulled his hat back on, and at the door he had paused and said, very quietly, I'm sorry, Jax. They aren't bad people. They are scared people. And scared people lose their better selves the longer the cold lasts. He had gone. Jax had stood at the kitchen window and watched his old sedan crawl back down the access road in the failing afternoon light, and Smoky had pressed her shoulder against his calf, and he had laid his scarred hand on her head and said nothing at all. The breaking came at 2:31 in the morning on the Saturday of the 5th week. The wind that night was up. The wind that night had been pushing against the farmhouse for 6 hours, and the windmill above the bench had been turning at a strong, even pull, and the sound of the cottonwoods along the creek bed, cracking under their armour of ice, had been carrying down through the dark, every few minutes in the long, slow way that those trees crack when they finally give up their branches. Jax had been asleep. Sleep had been thin. Sleep had been the kind of fragmented sleep he had been allowed for years now. He had been lying on his cot in the gutted living room beneath 2 blankets, and Smoky had been on her tarp by the wood stove, and the room had been full of the slow, even crackle of the dying fire. And at 2:31 in the morning the German Shepherd's head had come up off the tarp, and her ears had come forward, and her body had gone perfectly still. He was awake before he knew he was awake. The training had taken him back to the awake side of the line the way it always did. His eyes opened, his breathing did not change. He lay still beneath the blankets and listened with the long, total listening that a man learns in a country where listening is the single thing standing between him and the end of his life. He heard the wind, he heard the fire. He heard very faintly the soft scuff of a boot on snow somewhere behind the dairy barn. Smoky stood up. She did not bark, she did not whine. She moved across the wooden floor with the silent, low-shouldered tread of a working dog moving toward a perimeter breach. And at the door she stopped and turned her head and looked back at him exactly the way she had looked back at him in the foothills outside Sangin, in the second hour of a midnight patrol 7 years ago. Her amber eyes held his in the dim red light of the wood stove. Her tail did not move. He was already swinging his legs off the cot. He pulled on his boots without lacing them. He pulled on the surplus jacket. He took the loaded 35-7 revolver out of the shoebox under the bed and slid it into the coat pocket on his right side. He did not turn on the kerosene lamp. He did not need to. The wood stove gave him enough light to read the room, and his eyes had been adjusted to the dark for hours. He moved to the back door. Then, somewhere behind the dairy barn, glass broke. The sound of it cut through the wind in a thin, high, splintering crack that lasted no more than a second. It was the small window on the south side of the milling room. The window he had never bothered to reinforce because there was nothing in the milling room a man could carry off in the dark except the flour he had been giving the entire valley for free for 5 weeks running. The sound of it, that thin, high crack, hit Jax exactly the way certain sounds had always hit him. He was not in the kitchen of a farmhouse in Montana. He was in a courtyard in Helmand. He was 19 years old again, except he was 36. The dust was in his teeth. The radio chatter was in his right ear. The compound to his front had not yet been cleared, and the sound of breaking glass in the back room of the compound was the sound of the breach team going in, and his hands were on his rifle, and the weight of a 40-pound plate carrier was on his chest, and his heart rate was already climbing into the place where his own thinking became a thing happening to someone else. He did not let it pull him under. Not all the way. Smoky was against his left leg. Smoky was warm. Smoky was breathing. He breathed in for 4 counts. He held for 2. He breathed out for 6. He named 7 things he could see. The back door, the stove, the window, the shoebox, the boot, Smoky's amber eye, the shape of his own hand. He went out the back door with the revolver drawn and the dog at his heel. The cold hit him in the face. The wind pushed him sideways. He moved across the yard in the low, even gait of a man who had been trained to move across compromised ground in the dark, and Smoky moved silently 3 feet to his left, and the snow muffled their boots, and the wind covered their breath. And at the corner of the dairy barn he stopped and listened. 2 voices, low, inside the milling room, one voice cursing, one voice shushing the other. He came around the corner with the revolver up and Smoky beside him. The 2 figures were dim shapes in the dark of the milling room, both in heavy coats, both wearing knit balaclavas pulled down over their faces, both bent over the open lid of one of the food-grade buckets. The smaller one was holding a feed sack open. The larger one was scooping flour into the sack with his bare hands. Smoky's growl came up out of her chest like a low-controlled engine starting. The 2 figures froze. "Hands," Jax said. His voice was steady. The voice did not sound like his voice. The voice sounded like the voice he had used in the foothills outside Sangin. "Hands where I can see them. On the floor. Now." The larger one dropped the flour. The smaller one made a small high sound that was not a word. "Down. On your knees. Now." They went down on their knees on the wooden floor of the milling room, with their hands raised and the dim red light of the wood stove spilling in from the open door behind him, and the wind moving across the broken window, and the smell of fresh ground grain still hanging in the air. And Jax stepped into the room with the revolver up, and Smoky beside him and his pulse climbing in the back of his throat, and he reached out with his left hand and pulled the balaclava off the smaller one's head. He stopped breathing. The boy was 16 years old, maybe 17. He had bad acne along his jawline and a thin patchy attempt at a mustache and eyes that were the wide, terrified eyes of a teenager who had absolutely no business being where he was, and he was crying. He was crying the way teenage boys cry when they have done something stupid, and they have just realized exactly how stupid it was. Snot ran down his upper lip. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely keep them up. Jax knew his face. He had seen it twice before at the feed store. He was Tommy Hendricks, Carl Hendricks's nephew, Carl's brother's son, 16 years old. The breath went out of Jax in a single hard exhale. He pulled the balaclava off the larger one. A man in his 30s, skinny. Hollow-eyed, Jax did not know him. The man was crying too. The man had his hands up and was babbling something about kids and wife and propane, and Jax held up a hand and the man stopped. The revolver was still up. The revolver was still pointed at Tommy Hendricks's chest. Jax's hand was trembling. His hand was trembling in the way it had trembled exactly twice before in his life, both times in countries that were not this one. Both times when he had nearly done something his training and his discipline had barely kept him from doing. He was very close to the edge. He felt it. He felt it the way a man feels the moment when the floor is about to give. His whole body had gone narrow and hot, and the room had gone narrow with it, and the boy in front of him was no longer a 16-year-old. The boy in front of him was every face he had ever come around the corner of a doorway and found in the dark, and his hand was on a trigger, and his heart was somewhere very far away. Smoky moved. She did not bark. She did not growl any further. She walked. She walked across the wooden floor of the milling room, and she pressed the long, heavy line of her flank against his right thigh, from his hip down to his knee, and she leaned her full weight into him, and she lifted her head and looked up at him with her amber eyes, and her warm, soft chest was pressed against the back of his calf, and her breath was steady and slow against his leg. "Smoky!" The voice in the back of his head was his own voice. The voice was very quiet. Smoky was here. Smoky was warm. Smoky was breathing. The revolver lowered very slowly. He did not put it away. He held it down at his right side. He took one long breath in for 4 counts. He held for 2. He breathed out for 6. He named 7 things he could see: the boy, the man, the flour, the bucket, the wooden floor, Smoky's amber eye, the shape of his own hand. He breathed again. The room came back. The boy was a boy. The man was a man. The country was Montana. "Get up," he said. His voice was hoarse. They did not move. They were too afraid to move. "Get up. Now. Both of you." They got up. Tommy. Yes, sir. You're 16 years old. Yes, sir. 17. In April. You came up here in the middle of the night to steal flour from a man who has been giving it to your town for free for 5 weeks. The boy started to cry harder. He could not get a word out. I asked you a question, Tommy. Yes, sir. Why? My Uncle Carl S. said you. What did your Uncle Carl say? He said you were hoarding. He said you were going to start charging by the bag. He said somebody ought to teach you a lesson before you got too comfortable. Jax stood in the cold of the milling room with the wind moving through the broken window and the smell of the flour the boy had spilled across the wooden floor in the air, and the revolver heavy in his hand, and he closed his eyes for a moment, and he did not let himself do or say the thing his body wanted to do or say. Smoky pressed harder against his leg. He opened his eyes. And you, he said, to the man. Bobby Linwood, sir. I, my wife, the kids, we ran out of propane Tuesday. The house is, the man's voice broke. He could not finish. The Linwoods? Yes, sir. West side of town. Yes, sir. Jax looked at the floor. He looked at the spilled flour. He looked at the boy who was crying and the man who was crying. He looked at Smoky. He was so tired he could not stand it. Tommy. Yes, sir. Take the bucket. The boy stared at him. Sir. Take the bucket. Take it. Take it home. Tell your Uncle Carl I said it was a gift. Tell him, I said, the next time he wants to send a 16-year-old up here in the dark, he can come up here himself. Sir. I. Take it. The boy bent down. His hands were still shaking. He picked up the open bucket of flour. He held it against his chest. Bobby. Yes, sir. There's a 50-pound bucket on the second shelf to your right. It's already sealed. Take it. Take the propane bottle on the front porch. The small one. It's full. There's 2 more 50-pound buckets in the cellar. I'll bring them down to your place tomorrow morning. Tell your wife I'm sorry I didn't know. The man could not speak. He bent down and picked up the bucket. He took a small step toward Jax, and Smoky's head turned, and the man stopped where he was, and he said, in a thick, broken voice, God bless you, sir. God bless you. I'll work for you. I'll work for you every day until the lights come back on. I swear it. Just go home. Bobby. They went out into the snow. Jax stood in the doorway of the milling room and watched the dim shape of them disappear down the access road in the dark. The wind moved across the bench. The windmill turned. He stood in the open doorway for a long time with the revolver in his right hand, and Smoky pressed against his left leg, and the cold cutting through his jacket. And then his knees went out from under him, and he sat down hard in the snow at the threshold of the milling room, and he started to shake. He shook for a long time, his hands, his arms, his shoulders, the whole long line of his back. His teeth chattered. He could not stop them. Smoky lay down in the snow against his side and pressed her warm flank along the length of his ribs and laid her heavy head across his thigh. And he put his scarred hand on her head and he kept it there, and the wind moved over the both of them, and slowly, slowly the shaking eased. He sat there until the eastern sky began, sometime after 5, to grey very faintly at the bench. He went into the farmhouse. He fed the wood stove. He sat at the small wooden table in the kitchen, with his hands wrapped around a tin cup of cold water and Smoky on the floor at his feet. And he made the decision he had been making and unmaking for a year before he had ever come to Hollow Creek Valley. He stood up. He walked to the canvas bag beside the cot. He began to pack. He packed the change of clothes, the toothbrush in the plastic case, the multi-tool, the wallet, the water-warped paperback on small engine repair, the folded photographs. He stood for a long moment with the brown envelope in his hand. He did not open it. He set it in the bag. He pulled the drawstring closed. He was going to drive south. He was going to leave the farmhouse and the windmill and the mill and the buckets and the town. He was going to find a place where no one knew him and no one needed him, and no one was going to send a 16-year-old up to his door in the dark to be the boy he almost shot. The town would survive without him. The town had survived for 30 years without him. The mill would still be here in the spring. They could come and take the buckets. He did not need to be here for that. He sat down on the edge of the cot with the bag at his feet. He looked at Smoky. Smoky was on her tarp by the wood stove in her usual spot. She had not moved during the packing. She had watched him with her amber eyes the entire time. Her chin was on her front paws now. Her tail was still. She was looking at him with the same steady, patient look she had given him every morning for 3 years, and underneath that look, in the place where he had learned to read her, there was a thing he had not seen before. There was a kind of waiting. There was a kind of permission. She would go with him, the look said, wherever he went. She would always go with him. She would go down into the truck, and she would lie across his lap, and she would drive south with him until they ran out of road. But her amber eyes did not move. He sat for a long time with his hands on his knees and the canvas bag at his feet and the wood stove crackling in front of him and the German Shepherd watching him from her tarp. And he remembered, as clearly as anything he had ever remembered in his life, the morning in the foothills outside Sangin when his vehicle had taken the IED and the world had gone white and the heat had gone through him, and he had come awake on the floor of a half-collapsed compound with his right ear bleeding and his rifle pinned beneath the body of a man he had known since basic, and Smoky had come out of the smoke with one of her hindquarters streaming blood, and she had grabbed the back of his plate carrier in her teeth, and she had dragged him by inches across 40 feet of broken concrete to the corner where the rest of the squad was holding the line. She had been hit twice more before she got him there. She had not stopped. She had not let go. She had not left him. She had not left him. He sat on the edge of the cot for a long time. The dawn came up grey at the kitchen window. The wood stove popped. Smoky watched him. He stood up. He picked up the canvas bag. He walked it back to the corner where it had been. He set it down. He pulled the photographs out, one at a time, and laid them on the small wooden table. He left the brown envelope inside the bag. He did not need to open it. He did not need to leave it behind. He left the drawstring open, the way the bag had always been. Smoky's tail thumped once against the tarp. He went out to the milling room. The broken window was already letting the cold in. He found a sheet of plywood in the dairy barn. He cut it to size. He nailed it over the window with the small framing hammer he kept on the workbench. He cleaned up the spilled flour with a broom. He rinsed his hands in the cold water from the rain barrel. He fed the wood stove in the milling room. He oiled the gearbox. He released the brake on the windmill. The 8-bladed steel fan began, with a slow, reluctant groan, to turn. He stood beneath it in the cold of the morning with Smoky pressed against his left leg. By the time Maren Cole came up the access road at 7:40 with a pot of stew in the front seat, and her 2 children buckled in the back of the borrowed Chevy, the windmill was turning at a clean, even pull, and the milling room was warm, and the mill was running, and Jax Harlan was standing in the open doorway with white flour on his hands, and a tin cup of bitter coffee in his right hand, and a German Shepherd sitting at his left heel with her amber eyes fixed on the road. Maren parked. She got out. She walked across the gravel toward him with the pot of stew in her arms. She looked at him. She looked at the milling room. She looked at the snow at the threshold of the milling room where, in a small, irregular shape that the new fall had not yet covered, the print of a man's body and the print of a German Shepherd's body still lay side by side. She did not ask. She handed him the pot of stew. "Good morning." "Jax," she said. He nodded. He did not trust his voice yet. "Good morning, Maren." She looked at him a long second, longer than she usually did. Whatever she saw in his face, she did not name it. She went past him into the milling room with the stew and began to set the table for the workers who would be there inside the hour. Caleb climbed out of the back of the Chevy and walked across the snow with the small focused gravity of a 9-year-old, and Smoky rose from Jax's heel and went to meet him, and the boy laid his mittened hand on her broad forehead and her tail thumped against his thigh, and they walked together back toward the farmhouse. Jax stood for one more moment in the cold beneath the turning windmill. He breathed in for 4 counts. He held for 2. He breathed out for 6. He named 7 things he could see. Smoky was every one of them. The 7th week of the blackout came in on the eastern wind, and the eastern wind brought with it a high-pressure system from the Yukon that drove the daytime temperature in Hollow Creek Valley down to 19 below zero on the Tuesday before Christmas Eve. The cold settled across the valley in the way only a real Montana winter cold settles, in the way cold becomes a presence rather than a condition, in the way it pulls every line of every roof tighter and freezes the ice that had melted briefly on the south sides of the buildings into a hard new glaze that made every road and every walkway and every porch step a thing to be navigated rather than crossed. The chimneys of every wood stove in the valley ran 24 hours a day. The piles of split firewood in every yard shrunk. The pharmacy on Main Street rationed insulin again. Old Mrs. Hannity at the church organized a roster of younger people to check on the older people in town twice a day. The volunteer fire department drove its one running truck up and down the back roads checking on the cabins at the ends of the gravel routes. The men with the chainsaws had cleared the county road into town by the 3rd week, and the second wave of donated flour and donated wheat and donated bread had been moving from Jax's mill to the church, to the homes of the valley for almost a month, and every household in Hollow Creek had eaten bread Jax Harlan had ground in the past 7 days. Lily Cole had been coughing for 3 days. Maren had noticed it on Saturday afternoon, a small dry cough at first, the kind of cough a child gets in the dry indoor air of a long winter, the kind of cough you tell yourself is nothing. By Sunday night the cough had been wetter and deeper. By Monday morning Lily had not eaten her breakfast, and her cheeks had been flushed in a way that had nothing to do with the wood stove, and when Maren had pressed the back of her hand to her daughter's forehead at 6 in the morning before driving up the access road with a pan of biscuits, the heat that came off the small face had taken the breath out of her. The thermometer had read 102. By Tuesday morning 103.4. By Tuesday afternoon 104.1. The valley road north toward the hospital in Livingston was open in theory, but a second smaller storm front had come through Tuesday morning and dropped 4 inches of new snow on the pass road, and the state DOT had closed the pass road at noon, and the road would not be open again for at least 36 hours, and by then Maren did not know what would be left of her daughter's lungs to drive to a hospital with. She had brought Lily up to the farmhouse on Tuesday afternoon because the farmhouse had a wood stove that burned hotter and longer than the wall heater in the trailer, because the farmhouse had 2 extra blankets, because the farmhouse had Smoky, and because Maren Cole, who had been raising 2 children alone in a single wide trailer for 26 months without asking any human being on this earth for anything that she could conceivably do without, had finally arrived at the place where she could not do any of it without. Jax had taken one look at the child in her arms when they came through the door, and he had said, very quietly, "Front room. By the stove. I'll bring the cot." He had brought the cot from his own gutted living room into the small front room of the farmhouse where the wood stove ran hottest. He had laid the canvas of the cot with 2 of his 3 blankets and a folded quilt that had been on top of the wood box. He had banked the stove, he had stoked it, he had filled it, he had lit a second kerosene lamp on the table beside it, he had put a kettle on the propane burner. He had not asked Maren a single question. He had moved through the small rooms of the house with the controlled steady efficiency of a man who had been a corporal once and had carried wounded men out of buildings more times than he could count, and he had laid Lily down on the cot in front of the wood stove with the careful hands of a father who had not seen his own daughter in 3 years, and he had not said a word. Smoky had come into the room and lain down on her tarp by the stove 3 feet from the cot, and she had watched the child with her amber eyes, and her chin had been on her front paws, and she had not moved. By Wednesday morning the fever was at 104.6, and Lily was no longer fully conscious. Caleb was at the trailer with Mrs. Hannity from the church, who had volunteered to sit with him so that Maren could be at the farmhouse with her sister Lily. Maren had not slept since Tuesday night. She had not eaten since Tuesday afternoon. She sat on a wooden chair beside the cot with one hand on her daughter's hot small forehead and one hand wrapped around her daughter's small limp hand, and she kept whispering the same thing over and over again in a voice no one in the room was meant to hear. "Stay with me. Baby. Stay with me. Mama's here. Stay with me." Jax stood at the kitchen window with his scarred hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee he could not drink, and he watched the eastern bench come grey in the dawn. Word had moved through the valley the way word moves in valleys without phones. By 11 o'clock Wednesday morning, Pastor Daniels was at the farmhouse door, with his coat dusted in snow and his wife behind him with a quilted basket of clean towels. By noon, 3 women from the church were in the kitchen heating water on the propane burner and laying out cold compresses. By 2 in the afternoon, Sheriff Briggs had come up the access road with the volunteer fire chief and the volunteer fire department's 10-year-old portable oxygen tank, which had not been used in 17 months, and which the chief had checked twice on his own in the truck on the way up. By 4 in the afternoon, the small front room of the farmhouse had become the closest thing the valley had to a hospital, and the dairy barn and the kitchen and the gutted living room were full of quiet people who had come up the access road in their snow boots and their thrift store coats because a child in their valley was sick and there was no other place in the valley that could hold what was about to happen. Carl Hendricks came at 5:20. He came alone, in his old brown canvas coat, with his hat in his hands. He did not say anything to anyone. He walked across the gravel and up the steps of the farmhouse porch and through the kitchen door, and Pastor Daniels saw him first and stood up from his chair without a word and went to him and put one hand on his shoulder, and Carl said something so quietly that no one but the pastor heard it, and the pastor nodded once and stepped aside and let him pass. Carl walked through the kitchen and into the small front room where the wood stove burned and the kerosene lamps were lit, and Lily Cole lay beneath 3 blankets with her cheeks, the colour of old red brick, and her breath coming in small, wet, shallow pools. He stopped just inside the doorway. He stood there with his hat in his hands. He did not look at Jax. He did not look at Maren. He looked at the 7-year-old on the cot, and his big square hands began, very slightly, to tremble at the cuffs of his coat. He took a step backward and braced his shoulder against the doorframe, and he stayed there. He did not leave. Jax saw him there. Jax did not say anything. Jax did not need to say anything. The fever climbed. By 8 o'clock Wednesday evening, the small front room of the farmhouse was very quiet. The wood stove burned. The kerosene lamps gave the kind of soft yellow light that no electric lamp has ever managed to give. The air smelled of pine smoke and of the lavender oil. Mrs. Daniels had dabbed at Lily's wrists, and of the slow, clean smell of fresh ground grain that drifted in through the gaps around the kitchen door from the milling room beyond it. 40 people stood and sat in the rooms of the farmhouse and the porch and the kitchen and the dairy barn that had been opened at the side to take the overflow. The fire chief had set up the portable oxygen tank beside the cot with a child-sized mask, and Lily had been on a low flow of oxygen for 2 hours. The thermometer read 104.8. Lily had not opened her eyes since 5 o'clock. She was breathing in the small, wet, shallow pools that any nurse in any hospital in the Western Mountains would have recognized, and the fire chief had recognized them, and Maren had recognized them without being told. Maren was kneeling beside the cot with both of her hands wrapped around her daughter's small hot hand. Her dark hair had come loose from the tie at the back of her neck. Her eyes were closed. Her mouth was moving without sound. The diner uniform she had been wearing for 36 hours had a small pale crescent of flour on the right sleeve from a loaf she had baked Tuesday morning. Pastor Daniels stood at the foot of the cot with his head bowed. Mrs. Daniels had her hand on Maren's shoulder. Sheriff Briggs stood by the doorway with his hat in his hands. Mayor Wexler was somewhere in the kitchen, sitting at the small wooden table, his face in his hands. The fire chief was kneeling beside the oxygen tank, watching the regulator gauge. Carl Hendricks was still at the doorframe. He had not moved. Jax Harlan stood at the kitchen window with one hand pressed flat against the cold glass, and one hand pressed flat against his own thigh. He could feel the trembling under his palm. He did not let himself look at the child on the cot. He looked at the dark of the bench beyond the window. He breathed in for 4 counts. He held for 2. He breathed out for 6. He could not name 7 things he could see. He could only name 1. Smoky on her tarp by the stove. He could only name her over and over the way a man says a prayer that has only ever had 1 word in it. Smoky. The German Shepherd lifted her head off her front paws. She had been lying on the canvas tarp beside the wood stove for almost 28 hours without moving anything except her ribs. But now she lifted her head, and her ears came forward, and her amber eyes settled on the small flushed face on the cot 3 feet from her tarp. The motion was so slow and so quiet that no one in the front room noticed it for the first long second, and then Marin noticed it, because Marin was kneeling close enough to feel a very faint draft of motion across the back of her own hand. And Marin turned her head slowly, and Marin saw the German Shepherd looking at her daughter, and Marin did not move. Smoky stood up. She did not stand up the way a dog stands up to go outside. She stood up the way a dog stands up at the start of a mission. Every line of her body came into a slow, controlled order, the way the line of an old soldier's shoulders comes into order when he hears the first bar of a march he has not heard in 20 years. She stood for a moment on the tarp with her amber eyes on the child, and then she took a single step forward, and the wood floor creaked very softly under her weight, and every face in the small front room of the farmhouse turned toward her at once. Pastor Daniels lifted his head. Sheriff Briggs straightened from the doorway. The fire chief lowered his hand from the regulator. Mrs. Daniels did not breathe. Carl Hendricks's big square hand came up off the doorframe and pressed flat against the wood and stayed there. Smoky walked. She walked in the slow, steady, measured walk of a working dog, approaching a thing she had been called to. She did not look at any of the people in the room. She did not slow. She did not stop. She crossed the 4 feet of wooden floor between her tarp and the cot, and she came to the side of the cot where Marin was kneeling, and she stopped there. She lowered her broad grey head very slowly until her muzzle was 3 inches from Lily's small flushed face, and she breathed in once, long and slow, and then she breathed out again. Marin's free hand moved without thought and laid itself on Smoky's broad forehead, and the hand was trembling, and Marin did not seem to know it was trembling, and the dog did not move under the hand. The dog inhaled once more, very slowly, drawing in the smell of the child's breath the way a doctor takes a temperature with the back of the hand. The dog moved her muzzle very gently along the line of Lily's small thin chest, 3 inches above the blanket, sniffing once at the sternum, once at the upper ribs, once at the soft place under the jaw where the lymph nodes ran. Then she lay down. She lay down beside the cot, on the wood floor at first, in a long, careful stretch of her body, so that her flank ran along the entire length of Lily's left side. Her body was very warm, her breathing was very steady, her thick double coat pressed against the blanket. She lifted her head once more, very slowly, and she laid it across Lily's left shoulder, with her muzzle resting against the hollow at the base of the child's throat, and her amber eyes closed, and she did not move. The room did not breathe. Marin made a small sound. The sound was not a word. The sound was the small wet sound that comes out of a woman who has been holding herself together at the seams for 2 years and 4 months, and has just been touched very gently by something she did not know was still in the world. Pastor Daniels closed his eyes. Mrs. Daniels began very quietly to cry. Mrs. Hannity at the kitchen door pressed her hand to her mouth. The fire chief set down his clipboard. Carl Hendricks put both his hands over his face. Jax Harlan did not move from the kitchen window. His hand was still flat against the cold glass. His other hand was still flat against his own thigh, and the trembling had gone out of him, very slowly, the way the trembling goes out of a man who has just been given back, a thing he did not know he had lost. He turned very slowly, and he looked across the kitchen and through the open doorway into the small front room, and he saw the German Shepherd lying along the entire length of his daughter's body in that same shape. He saw the dog who had pulled him out of a half-collapsed compound in Helmand 7 years ago, lying beside a 7-year-old in a small Montana farmhouse, doing what she had always done, which was finding the soldier in the room who could not walk out on her own, and lending that soldier her body, and her warmth, and her slow, steady, patient breath, and not moving until the soldier could move on her own again. He saw all of that across the warm yellow lamplight of 2 rooms, and he did not let himself cry, because he did not believe yet that she would be able to bring this one out, and he was not going to mourn yet, because if he mourned yet, he would not be able to do whatever else needed to be done in the long night that still lay ahead. He turned back to the cold window. He breathed in for 4 counts. He held for 2. He breathed out for 6. The hours passed. The wood stove was fed at 10 and at midnight and at 2 and at 4. The cold compresses were changed every 20 minutes. Mrs. Hannity made coffee on the propane burner, and the people in the rooms drank it without sugar, and no one spoke above a whisper. Pastor Daniels prayed quietly with his hands on the foot of the cot. Mrs. Daniels prayed beside him. Sheriff Briggs went out to the porch twice and stood in the cold and came back in. Mayor Wexler did not move from the kitchen table. Carl Hendricks did not move from the doorframe. The fire chief watched the gauge. And Smoky did not move. She lay along the entire left side of the small body on the cot, with her flank pressed against the child and her broad grey head resting on the child's left shoulder, and she breathed in slow, long, measured breaths that any soldier in the room would have recognized as the kind of breathing a dog has been trained to give a wounded man through the long minutes before the medevac comes. And she did not lift her head, and she did not shift her weight, and her amber eyes opened twice, both times to look very slowly across the room to the kitchen window where Jax Harlan was standing, and to hold his gaze for one long second, and then to close again. We are still here, at 1:57 in the morning, in the small specific way that a dog who has been working for hours suddenly settles a fraction further into a wounded soldier when the soldier's vitals turn the corner. Smoky's body let out a slow, long breath, and her shoulders dropped half an inch, and her tail thumped once, very softly, against the wood floor. The fire chief looked down at the regulator gauge. He looked at Lily. He pressed 2 fingers very gently to the small wrist on the blanket. His face did not change. He looked across the room at Pastor Daniels. He nodded once. Maren made a sound. It was a small, wet, hard sound that broke at the back of her throat. She bent forward, very slowly, until her forehead touched the blanket beside Smoky's head, and she stayed there. The fever broke at 3:12 in the morning. Lily's small hand, which had been curled limp and hot in her mother's palm for 36 hours, twitched. The curled fingers opened. The damp small fingers found Smoky's thick grey fur where it spread along the edge of the blanket, and they closed around a fistful of it, and they held it. Lily did not open her eyes, but her breath, which had been the small, wet, shallow pulls of an animal close to the edge, lengthened into a slow, even pull that reached the bottom of her lungs. The flushed brick red of her cheeks drained, very slowly, into a paler tired pink. Her body went very quietly into the deep, healing, exhausted sleep of a child whose fever has finally let her go. Smoky did not move. Smoky stayed against her. For the rest of the night the German Shepherd lay along the small body on the cot, and the small fingers of the 7-year-old stayed knotted in her thick fur, and the dog did not move, and the wood stove burned, and the lamps gave their soft yellow light, and the people in the rooms of the farmhouse stood and sat and prayed and did not speak. Maren collapsed at 3:40. Not dramatically, quietly. The way a thing collapses when the thing has been holding up a building for a very long time, and has finally been told it can put the building down. She rose from her knees beside the cot. She walked 4 steps across the small front room toward the kitchen doorway. Her legs gave out underneath her halfway across, and she put a hand against the wall, and her eyes met Jax Harlan's across the warm yellow light of 2 rooms, and Jax stepped forward and crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, and he caught her by the elbows just before her knees touched the floor. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. She put her forehead against the front of his old surplus jacket, where her face fit against the small worn place at the centre of his chest, and she pressed her hands flat against the front of his shoulders, and her whole body shook in a long, single, rolling shake, the way a body shakes when a very heavy thing has finally been allowed to set down. He stood very still. He held her. He did not pull her in. He did not speak. He let her shake against him. He let her cry the way a woman cries who has not let herself cry for 26 months. Across the room, Mrs. Daniels turned her face into her husband's shoulder and wept silently. Mrs. Hannity sat down on a kitchen chair and put her face in her apron. Mayor Wexler took his face out of his hands and looked at Jax. And his eyes were red-rimmed and old. The fire chief looked down at the gauge. Carl Hendricks took his hands away from his face. The big square hands were wet. The big grey-bearded face was wet. He looked across the warm yellow light of the small front room, and he looked at Smoky lying along the body of the 7-year-old, and he looked at Jax Harlan holding the small shape of Marin Cole against the worn place at the centre of his old surplus jacket, and Carl Hendricks did not say anything at all. He stood at the doorframe with the wet on his face and his hat in his hands, and he watched the dog who had once been a war dog choose to be a healer, and he watched the man who had once been a soldier hold up a woman who had been holding herself up alone for 2 years, and he stayed very still, and the thing that had been working in him for 15 weeks finally cracked. Marin breathed in. She breathed out. She lifted her head from Jax's chest. "Thank you," she whispered. The word was only barely a word. He did not answer. He did not have an answer. He nodded once, slowly. She stepped back. She steadied herself with one hand on the kitchen doorframe. She turned, and she walked back into the front room, and she knelt beside the cot, and she laid her hand on Smoky's broad forehead, and she said in a voice so soft that only the dog could hear it, "Thank you, Mama. Thank you. You stay with her. You stay." Smoky's tail thumped once against the floor. She did not move from the cot until dawn. The eastern sky began to grey at 6:30. The wood stove had been fed every 2 hours through the night. The kerosene lamps had burned down by half. The 40 people who had stood and sat in the rooms of the farmhouse and the dairy barn began, very slowly, to leave. They left in pairs and in small groups, with their snow boots quiet on the wood floor, with their thrift store coats pulled around their shoulders, with their faces tired and changed in a way that would not be undone for the rest of their lives. Pastor Daniels and Sheriff Briggs were the last to go. They paused at the door. The pastor looked at Jax. He did not say anything. He nodded once, very slowly, and pulled on his hat, and he and the sheriff walked out into the cold dawn with the snow crunching under their boots. Carl Hendricks stayed. He did not move from the doorframe. He stayed there until the room was nearly empty. He stayed there until Marin had fallen asleep in a chair beside the cot, with her head against the wall and her hand on her daughter's hand. He stayed there until Smoky had finally very slowly lifted her broad grey head off Lily's shoulder and rolled her weight to her front paws and risen. The German Shepherd stood for a moment beside the cot in the grey dawn light, and her amber eyes closed for a long breath, and she stretched, the slow stretch of a dog who has been working for hours, and she walked. She walked across the wood floor of the small front room. She walked past Carl Hendricks at the doorframe, and her shoulder brushed lightly against the side of his knee as she passed, and her amber eyes lifted once to his face, and Carl Hendricks's big square hand came down very slowly and rested for a single second on the top of her broad grey head. She did not stop. She did not pull away. She let the hand rest there, and then she walked on, and she crossed the kitchen, and she came to Jax Harlan, who had sat down on a wooden chair at the small kitchen table and had his head in his hands, and she lay down against the leg of his chair, and she pressed her warm flank against his calf, and she let out a long, slow, exhausted breath. Jax took his hands away from his face. He looked down at the dog. He looked at her amber eye, which was tired and old and gentle, and he laid his scarred hand on her head, and he kept it there, and he did not say anything, and the morning light came up at the kitchen window, and somewhere in the small front room, the 7-year-old slept the deep, clean sleep of a child whose fever had broken. Carl Hendricks took his hand off the doorframe. He pulled on his hat. He walked through the kitchen toward the door. He stopped beside Jax's chair. He did not look at Jax. He did not say anything. He laid his big square hand once, very lightly, on Jax's shoulder. He held it there for one long breath. He took it away. He went out into the cold dawn. Jax kept his hand on Smoky's head. The wind moved across the bench. The windmill turned. The night Carl Hendricks came back was the night the wind dropped. It dropped in the slow, particular way wind drops in the second half of a long Montana cold, easing across the bench above the farmhouse in the early afternoon, and going still by sunset, leaving behind it the kind of deep listening cold that lets a man hear his own boots crunch in the snow from 200 yards away. The valley had been changed since Christmas Eve. The change was not a thing anyone in the valley had named. The change moved through the rooms of the homes and the pews of the church and the lines at the distribution counter at the parish hall in 1,000 small ways that nobody in Hollow Creek would ever afterward be able to describe in full. Lily Cole's fever had broken on the dawn of the 25th, and she had opened her eyes for the first time at 7:50 that morning, and she had asked her mother where Smoky was, and Smoky had been at her feet on the floor of the small front room of the farmhouse. And Smoky had risen at the sound of her name and laid her chin on the edge of the cot, and looked at the child with her amber eyes, and Lily had laid her small hand on the German Shepherd's broad forehead and said, in a thin hoarse voice, "Hi, Smoky," and the dog's tail had thumped once against the wood floor, and Maren had pressed her face into the blanket beside the dog and cried in the way a mother cries when a thing she had been bracing herself to lose has been given back to her. By the second day of Christmas, the road north toward Livingston had opened, and the fire chief had driven Lily and Maren to the hospital in his own truck, and the doctor in the emergency room had listened to Lily's lungs and read her temperature, and done the small careful tests they did in places like Livingston in storms like this one, and the doctor had said, in the short professional voice of a man who was not in the habit of overstating, "She's all right, she's tired, and her lungs are tender, and she's lucky. Whoever kept her warm and stable through the worst of it kept her alive." Maren had not told the doctor about the dog. The fire chief had. The doctor had taken it in. The doctor had said, "Well, there's a number of ways to keep a body stable. That'll do as well as most." He had written a prescription for a course of antibiotics. He had sent them home. The valley road into town had been clear since the third week. The pass road had been clear since Wednesday. The state line crews were working their way east across the county, and the lineman in his orange truck had told Sheriff Briggs on Tuesday morning that they expected to have power restored to the western half of Hollow Creek by Friday and to the rest of the valley within the week. The blackout was almost over. 89 days. The valley would tell its own story to itself for the next 40 years about those 89 days. The valley would tell the story differently in different houses, but every version of it would have a windmill in it, and every version of it would have a German Shepherd in it. Carl Hendricks came up the gravel access road at 11:20 Tuesday night. The wind had been still for 3 hours. The eastern bench was very dark. The sky above the bench was a cold black sheet of stars that does not exist in places where the lights have come back on. The temperature was 23 below. The air motor stood motionless at the high end of the property in the windless dark, 8 steel blades still and silent against the stars. The farmhouse glowed faintly from the wood stove and a single kerosene lamp at the kitchen window. Smoke rose straight up out of the chimney in a thin pale column. Carl's old Chevy crunched up the gravel and stopped at the cattle guard. He did not pull all the way in. He sat in the cab for a long time with the engine off. His big grey-bearded head bowed forward over his hands on the wheel. The cab cooled. He pulled on his hat. He got out. He walked the last 40 feet up the gravel drive in the dark with his boots breaking through the frozen crust at every step. And at the porch of the farmhouse he stopped and stood with his hat in his big square hands. He did not have to knock. The door opened. Jax Harlan stood in the open doorway with the soft yellow light of the wood stove behind him. He was in shirt sleeves and the worn surplus jacket thrown over his shoulders. His scarred hands were empty. Smoky stood at his left heel with her amber eyes on Carl, her ears forward, her body still. She did not growl. She did not stiffen. She watched. "Come in," Carl Jax said. He held the door open. Carl came in. He stamped the snow off his boots on the small frayed rag mat. He pulled off his hat. He stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse in his brown canvas coat, with his big square hands twisting at the brim of his hat, and he did not look at Jax. He looked at the wooden floor. He looked at the wood stove. He looked at the cot in the small front room where, 3 days ago, his life had cracked open and started to come out. Jax pointed to one of the wooden chairs at the small table. Carl sat. He set the hat on his knee. He did not take off the coat. Jax took down 2 tin cups from the shelf above the stove. He poured coffee from the dented enamel pot. He set 1 cup in front of Carl and 1 cup across the table at his own seat. He sat down. Smoky lay down on the floor between the 2 chairs, with her head on her front paws and her amber eyes half open, and she breathed slowly and steadily. The wood stove popped. The kerosene lamp gave its soft yellow light. Outside the window, the eastern bench was very dark and very still. For a long time, neither man spoke. Carl looked at his hands. His hands had been farm hands and feed store hands and engine mechanic hands for 50 years. They were thick at the knuckles and split at the cuticles from the long winter, and they were trembling very slightly, the way a man's hands tremble when the man has been holding back something for a great many years and has finally arrived at the morning when the holding back is going to end. He breathed in. He breathed out. He said, quietly, "My boy was Operation Mountain Resolve." Jax did not move. Carl said, "Daniel Hendricks, 23, 2nd Platoon." Jax's hand on the tin cup did not move. His face did not move. Something behind his ribs went very still in the way a thing goes still when it has finally been spoken. "I knew him," Jax said. "I figured you might." He kept a photograph in his helmet. His daughter, Ali, 18 months at the time. He was always talking about her. He was a long silence. Carl said, "He died on the second to last day. I know, IED. They told me he didn't suffer." Jax looked down at his coffee. He looked up. He held Carl's eyes. He gave Carl the truth that Carl had not been given, because he had decided in the last 60 seconds that this man across the table from him had earned the truth, and that anything less than the truth would be a smaller cruelty than the cruelty Carl had already been carrying. He didn't. Carl, Jax said, "I was there. He was 20 feet from me when the device went off. He didn't know it happened. He'd been laughing 2 minutes before, telling me about a song his wife was teaching Ali at home. His last word was the chorus of that song. He didn't suffer. I'm sorry." Carl Hendricks's mouth opened. Nothing came out for a long moment. Then he made a small sound at the back of his throat, the kind of sound a large animal makes when it has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has finally stopped. And his big square shoulders folded forward, and he put his face into his hands and he wept. He wept the way a 63-year-old man weeps when he has not let himself weep in 15 years. He wept in long, shaking, silent shudders that came up from somewhere deep beneath the brown canvas coat and worked their way out through his shoulders and his ribs and his chest, and his hands stayed pressed against his face, and the kitchen of the farmhouse held very still around him. Jax did not move. Jax did not get up. Jax did not put a hand on his shoulder. Jax sat across the table with his hands wrapped around his tin cup and his eyes on Carl's bent grey head, and he did the only thing a man like him knew how to do at a moment like that, which was to be there, to stay there, to not look away, to bear witness without speaking, the way certain wounds had to be borne witness to without speaking. Smoky rose, very slowly, from the floor between the two chairs. She rose with the same slow controlled order she had risen with on Christmas Eve. She walked the same slow measured walk around the leg of the table to Carl's chair, and she stopped beside his right knee, and she lowered her broad grey head and laid her muzzle very gently across the top of his clenched fist where it pressed against his face. Carl's hand came down. It came down slowly. The rough skin of his big knuckles brushed against her muzzle, and then his hand opened, and he laid it flat on the broad grey fur of her head, and he held it there. He kept his other hand over his eyes. He went on weeping. Smoky did not move. The two of them stayed like that for a very long time. When Carl finally lifted his face from his hand, the wet was on his beard and on the front of his coat. He did not wipe it away. He looked across the table at Jax. He did not look away from Jax. He held the gaze. "I knew you were there," he said. His voice was wrecked and quiet. "The moment I heard your name and your unit, the moment the realtor at the courthouse said somebody bought the old Polk place, name of Harlan, used to be Army, I knew I went home that day, and I sat in my truck in my own driveway for an hour." "Why didn't you say anything to me?" "Carl, because I hated you." "All right. Because you came back." "All right. Because Daniel didn't. Because every day of every year since the day they brought him home in a box, my wife has gone to bed at 9 o'clock, and she hasn't come out of that bedroom before noon, and I have sat at our kitchen table by myself with my coffee in the morning, And I have asked God why my boy and not somebody else's, and somewhere in there I went looking for a somebody else, and you walked into my feed store one Tuesday in September with that dog of yours, and I picked you. I picked you. Jax. That's what I did. I needed somebody to be the reason I picked the man who came home. The wood stove popped. Jax breathed in. He breathed out. He looked at his coffee. He looked back up. I understand, he said. He said it slowly. He said it the way a man says a thing he has decided to say carefully and exactly. I understand it, Carl. I don't pretend I don't. There were days over there when I picked a face too, some sergeant we didn't like, some lieutenant who made a call that put Daniel and 3 other men in the wrong place at the wrong time. I picked. I held it, sometimes for years, so I understand. I won't tell you it didn't cost me anything to walk into your feed store and walk out of it again. It cost me, and I won't tell you it's all right, because it isn't. But I understand. I know you do. I won't pretend nothing happened. Carl. No, sir. I wouldn't ask you to. But Carl waited. Jax looked down at Smoky's head under Carl's hand. He looked up. I'll work next to you in the morning, Jax said. Whatever needs doing. The wheat's coming up tomorrow from over by Big Timber. The mill needs to run. I could use the hands. That's what I have to give you. Carl Hendricks closed his eyes. 2 more tears went down his beard. He opened his eyes. That's more than I deserve. It's what I have. The 2 men sat for another long moment in the warm yellow light of the kitchen, with the German Shepherd standing between them and the wood stove popping slow, and outside the windless winter night, holding the dark valley like a hand cupped around a candle. Carl moved to stand. He stopped. He looked at Jax. He had a letter. Jax went very still. In his pack. Didn't get sent. Came home with the rest of his stuff. I read it once, and I put it in a box, and I haven't been able to look at it again. I thought you ought to know. What did it say? Carl's voice broke at the edges. He held it. He thanked you, he said the night before. When the unit was sleeping rough and the shelling was on the next ridge over, he was scared. He said he was a lot more scared than he'd let himself be scared in a long time. He said he was thinking about Ali and about Sue and about not getting to see them again. And he said you sat next to him on a piece of busted concrete and didn't say anything for a long time. He said you finally asked him what his daughter's name meant. He said you talked to him about her until he could breathe again. He said he wrote it down because if he made it home he wanted to thank you face to face, and if he didn't, he wanted you to know what that hour had been to him. Jax remembered the night. He remembered the shelling on the next ridge. He remembered the piece of busted concrete. He remembered the boy sitting beside him very young with his hands wrapped around his rifle, and he remembered asking the boy about his daughter's name because he had run out of any other thing he could think of to say. His eyes filled. He did not let it go any further than that. Ali, he said. His voice was rough. It was short for Alana. She was named after Daniel's grandmother. Yeah. He told me his grandmother once skinned her own knuckles bare washing other people's laundry to put him through community college. Yeah, she did. Lord, she did. Tell Sue. Tell her what? Tell her her boy thanked me, and tell her he was the kind of man who thanks somebody. Tell her she raised him right. Tell her the song his wife was teaching. Ali was the song he was singing the morning he died, and he was singing it because his daughter loved it. And he died loving her. Tell her that, Carl, from me. Carl Hendricks's mouth moved. He could not get a sound out. He nodded once, slowly. He nodded again. He stood up. He pulled on his hat with both hands. He looked once more at Smoky, who was still standing beside him, and he laid his hand on her broad grey head one more time, very gently, and then he turned and walked through the kitchen and out the front door of the farmhouse and into the dark. His Chevy started after a long minute. The headlights turned. The truck went down the gravel drive and out onto the county road and away. Jax sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he stood up and walked across the kitchen and into the small front room where the wood stove burned and the cot still sat in front of it. and he sat down on the edge of the cot with his hands on his knees, and he let his head come forward into his palms, and he let himself cry the way Carl Hendricks had let himself cry. Finally, in the full unguarded way a man cries when he has not allowed himself to cry in a very long time. Smoky came across the floor and pressed her forehead into his thigh. He moved one hand off his face and laid it on her head. He cried with his fingers in her thick grey fur. When the worst of it eased, he sat with his hand still on her head and his breath still uneven. And he said, very quietly, into the warm yellow lamplight of the small front room, the only words he had to say to her at that moment, "You did good, soldier." Her tail thumped once against the floor. The next morning Carl Hendricks was at the gravel cattle guard at 6:40 in the dawn cold, with a pair of leather work gloves in his hand and his old brown canvas coat, buttoned all the way to his throat. He did not say good morning, he did not need to. He walked up the drive with the cold steam coming off his beard in the dim blue light, and he came into the milling room, and he picked up the empty feed sack at the foot of the bucket line, and he held it open while Bobby Linwood, who had been there since 5:30, ladled the warm, fresh ground flour into it from the catch box. He did not look at Jax, he did not need to. His big square hands were steady. By 8 in the morning the men were at the mill in their full crew, 6 of them, the regular crew that had come up the access route every dawn for nearly 7 weeks. By 9 the millstones were turning at their steady, even pull. By 10 Marin Cole had come up the road in the borrowed Chevy with Caleb in the passenger seat, and Lily wrapped in a heavy quilt in the back, the small girl pale and tired but bright-eyed, her cheeks back to their proper pale freckled colour, her small hand reaching out for Smoky's broad grey head before her boots had even hit the gravel. Smoky met her at the running board. The dog's tail swept once against the side of the truck. The 7-year-old buried her face in the thick winter coat the way a child buries her face in something she has decided is her own forever, and Marin stood in the snow beside the open door of the truck and watched and did not interrupt. Marin came across the gravel toward the milling room. She stopped at the door. She looked at Jax across the work line. She looked at Carl Hendricks holding the open sack at the foot of the bucket line. She looked at the 2 men working 4 feet apart with the warm, fresh flour going down between them. She did not say anything. The corner of her mouth lifted. She nodded once, very slowly. Jax nodded back. The lineman in the orange truck reached the western half of Hollow Creek at 3:12 on Friday afternoon. The lights came back on in the trailer parks at 3:40. The lights came back on in the diner at the truck stop at 4:18. The lights came back on at the church at 5:06. The town stood out on its porches in the cold dusk and watched the small yellow squares of windows light up across the valley one by one, the way certain things light up one by one when a long winter has finally decided to break. The power came back to the eastern bench at 6:51 Friday evening. Jax was in the milling room when it happened. He was checking the alignment on the millstones for the next morning's run. The small overhead bulb that he had installed when he had first moved in, and that he had wired to a deep-cycle marine battery that had run dry weeks ago, came on at 6:51 with a small dim flicker, and then a slow, steady, warm glow. He stood under it for a long moment. Smoky was at his left heel. She looked up at the small bulb. Her ears came forward. Her tail thumped once against the wooden floor. He laid his scarred hand on her head, and he kept it there, and the 8-bladed steel fan above the bench turned slow, and even in the windless winter dusk, and the small overhead bulb burned down on the warm pale flour at the bottom of the catchbox, and the long ordeal of the valley was, very quietly, over. Spring came late to Hollow Creek Valley that year. The snow held in the high passes through the second week of April, and the cottonwoods along the creek did not start their pale green until almost May. But on a warm, clean Saturday morning in the first week of the month, the wind off the bench was soft and full of the smell of new earth, and the farmhouse roof Jax had been rebuilding all April was nearly closed in. He sat on the front porch in shirt-sleeves with a tin cup of coffee in his hand and Smoky beside him on the worn boards. The air motor turned slow, and even at the high northwest corner of the property, on the small porch table beside him sat an unopened envelope. The handwriting on the envelope was small and round and careful. The return address was San Diego. The name on the return address was Cora Harlan. He had been looking at the name for 2 days. He had not opened it yet. He kept setting it down. He kept picking it up. A truck turned up the gravel drive, the borrowed Chevy, Marin at the wheel, Caleb in the passenger seat with a cardboard tray of bedding plants in his lap, Lily already leaning out the back window and calling to the German Shepherd in the bright voice of a 7-year-old who had decided that this dog was hers forever and that the matter was settled. Smoky's tail thumped twice against the boards. She rose. She walked to the top of the porch steps and waited. The truck stopped. The doors opened. Lily climbed out and ran across the gravel and threw both arms around Smoky's broad grey neck. Smoky sat. She let herself be hugged. Her tail swept once across the porch. Marin came up the steps with a paper bag in her hand. She stopped beside the porch chair. She set the bag down on the small table beside the unopened envelope. "Bread," she said. "Just out of the oven." "Thank you." Marin. She looked at the envelope. She looked at him. She did not ask. He picked it up. He held it in both his scarred hands. He looked across the gravel at his 9-year-old son figure, helping his daughter Lily down off the running board, at the 7-year-old bouncing on her toes beside the German Shepherd, at the windmill turning steady and quiet against the May sky. He slid the envelope into the pocket of his shirt, over his heart. He stood up. "Let's get those plants in the ground," he said. He came down the porch steps with Smoky beside him. The wind moved across the bench. The 8-bladed steel fan turned in the morning sun. He walked toward the woman and the children waiting for him in the bright, warm spring light. And the dog walked at his left heel, and the windmill turned, and the wheat in the south field was already coming up green. We are not what they took from us. We are what we still build. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.